When I accidentally overheard my parents say that I was a mistake from the past and just material for extracting money, I found my biological parents, and then I never thought the day my parents finally got married would be the day my life would unravel. For as long as I could remember, they'd been together. They had a relationship that everyone assumed would eventually lead to marriage, and I always believed they just hadn't felt the need to make it official. But this year, they decided to tie the knot, and I thought it would be a day filled with joy and a sense of completeness. I'd waited for this moment, feeling that it would solidify our family in a way nothing else could. The ceremony was beautiful, the kind of picturesque setting you'd see in magazines. Sun shining, flowers blooming, friends and family gathered. I was nervous and excited, but mostly, I was happy for them. Watching my parents exchange vows felt like the final piece falling into place, like this was the way it was always meant to be. After the ceremony, I slipped away to a side room just to take a moment for myself. It was overwhelming, in a good way. I needed a minute to breathe, to let it all sink in. That's when I heard them. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their voices drifted through the door, clear as day. "I still can't believe we're finally getting married," my mom said, her voice filled with a kind of happiness that made me smile. At first, "Yes," my dad replied, with a tone that surprised me. It sounded almost relieved. It's a relief to finally put that chapter behind us. No more reminders of our past mistakes. There was a pause, and my heart started pounding. A past mistake? I held my breath, hoping to hear something that would prove I'd misunderstood. But then my mom responded, confirming my worst fears. "I know. We can finally move forward, just us." I felt like the floor had fallen out from under me. They were talking about me. There was no other way to interpret it. All my life, I'd thought I was the center of their world. But now, in this moment, I was nothing but a mistake they wanted to leave behind. It was a betrayal I hadn't seen coming, one that cut deeper than any I'd ever known. Without thinking, I pushed open the door. The look on their faces when they saw me standing there said it all. They were startled, caught off guard. My mom quickly tried to cover it up with a smile, but I saw through it. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Am I the mistake you were hoping to leave behind?" My dad rubbed his hand over his face, exhaling as if he'd been holding it in all day. "Liam, this really isn't the time. We didn't mean for you to hear that." "But I did," I shot back, my eyes stinging. "I heard everything. You think I'm a mistake? That I'm some burden you're trying to get rid of?" My mom put a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off. "Liam, please, you don't understand. It's not as simple as you think." "Then explain it to me." I couldn't control the volume of my voice. I didn't care if I was making a scene. I needed answers. But they just exchanged glances, and my dad let out a frustrated sigh. "This isn't the time, Liam. We'll talk about it later. Let's not ruin today." And with that, they brushed past me, leaving me standing there, alone and reeling. It felt like I'd been sucker punched. My parents, the people I had trusted most in this world, saw me as a mistake. My whole life, I thought we were a family, a unit. Now, I didn't even know who I was to them. I drifted through the rest of the day in a daze. Everything around me felt distant, like I was watching it all happen from far away. I barely remember the reception, the speeches, or the toasts. All I could think about was their conversation, the coldness in their voices, the dismissal in their words. I kept replaying it over and over in my head, hoping I'd misunderstood, that I'd somehow gotten it wrong. But I hadn't. I knew what I'd heard. That night, I couldn't stay in that house. I needed to talk to someone who would actually listen. So, I called Sophie. She answered on the second ring, and I knew by the sound of her voice that she could tell something was wrong. "Liam, are you okay?" she asked, concern lacing her tone. "No. I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "Of course. Come right over." I barely remember the drive, but the next thing I knew, I was sitting on Sophie's couch, pouring out everything that had happened. I told her about the wedding, the overheard conversation, the way my parents had dismissed me like I was nothing. By the time I finished, I was shaking, my hands clenched into fists. Sophie listened without interrupting, her expression a mix of sympathy and disbelief. Liam, I'm so sorry. I can't believe they'd say something like that. Are you sure you heard them right? I wish I hadn't, I replied, my voice hollow. But they didn't even deny it. They just brushed me off, like I didn't even deserve an explanation. She reached out, placing a comforting hand on my arm. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but maybe there's more to it? Something they haven't told you? That's what I keep thinking. I mean, why would they say something like that? What could make them feel that way about me? We need to find out, she said firmly. Look, if they won't tell you the truth, we'll find it ourselves. There has to be something in your family's past, something they don't want you to know. I nodded, a mix of anger and curiosity fueling me. Where do we even start? It's not like they're going to leave clues lying around. Sometimes, people aren't as careful as they think, Sophie replied, a spark of determination in her eyes. Old family records, maybe some documents they've kept. You'd be surprised what you can find if you know where to look. We started digging the next day. I convinced my parents that I was feeling under the weather and needed some time alone, which gave me free rein to explore. Sophie and I combed through every drawer, every closet, searching for anything that might hint at the truth. It wasn't until we found an old, dusty box in the attic that things started to click. The box was buried beneath piles of old clothes and forgotten memorabilia, as if someone had tried to hide it but hadn't quite finished the job. Inside, I found stacks of documents, bank statements, transaction records, strange receipts that made no sense. What is all this? I asked, pulling out a bundle of papers. My hands were shaking again, but this time, it was from something else. Dread. Sophie took one of the statements, her eyes scanning the page before widening. Liam, these aren't normal transactions. Look at this. There are huge deposits going into their accounts, but they're from different places, different people. I glanced at the papers in my hand, my stomach twisting as I saw the same thing. It was like a puzzle, each piece revealing something I hadn't wanted to see. Why would they be getting this kind of money? And why would they hide it? That's the question, Sophie replied, a mix of excitement and concern in her voice. There's more going on here than we thought. They've been hiding something from you, something big. I felt a surge of determination. Whatever they were hiding, I was going to find out. I wasn't going to be left in the dark, not anymore. If they thought they could brush me aside, treat me like a mistake they could just forget about, they were wrong. This was my life, and I deserved to know the truth. As Sophie and I sifted through the documents, I realized that my parents' secrets went deeper than I could have ever imagined. And whatever it was they were hiding, I was going to uncover it, no matter how painful it might be. I wasn't going to stop until I had answers, until I knew who my parents really were, and, more importantly, who I really was. The more I uncovered, the more my world began to feel like a carefully constructed lie. After finding the documents, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to stop until I had the full picture. I felt betrayed, angry, and determined, driven by a need to understand why my parents would treat me as nothing more than a pawn in their schemes. My suspicions grew as I pored over the documents with Sophie. Each paper painted a damning picture, revealing a web of transactions that didn't add up. They were siphoning money from mysterious accounts, all under the guise of family finances. It was clear they'd been skimming off the top, and the sums weren't small. I couldn't believe I'd been blind to this for so long. But then again, they had always been good at hiding things, hadn't they? I couldn't confront them just yet. I needed more proof, something concrete that they couldn't worm their way out of. I thought about who else might know something about my parents, someone who could help me make sense of it all. That's when I remembered Mr. Clark, an old family friend who'd known my parents for as long as I could remember. He used to work as a lawyer before retiring, and he was someone I'd always trusted. If anyone could give me some insight, it was him. I paid him a visit under the pretense of catching up. After the usual pleasantries, I decided to lay my cards on the table. I told him about the wedding, the conversation I'd overheard, and the discovery of the documents. To my surprise, Mr. Clark didn't seem as shocked as I'd expected. He nodded, listening intently, his face grave but unsurprised. Liam, he said, sighing deeply, there's a lot you don't know about your parents. And perhaps it's time you did. He went on to explain that he'd known about their shady dealings for years, but he'd never been able to prove it. According to Mr. Clark, my parents had made a habit of cozying up to wealthy people, ingratiating themselves until they found an opportunity to steal. It wasn't just a one-off thing. They had a pattern, a method. They'd done it time and again, leaving a trail of ruined lives in their wake. They always seemed so charming, so personable, Mr. Clark continued, shaking his head. But behind closed doors, they were ruthless. I suspected they were using you, but I never had any proof. My stomach churned as I listened, the reality of my situation becoming clearer with every word. They had used me as bait, as leverage to gain sympathy, to make themselves seem like loving parents who deserved trust and generosity. And it had worked, time after time. All the while, they'd been siphoning off money, exploiting anyone who crossed their path. Did you know they've been stealing money meant for me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I found bank statements, transactions from accounts that don't belong to them. Mr. Clark nodded slowly. Yes, Liam. I suspected as much. I think they've been using you in more ways than you realize. They've always been good at manipulation, at making people believe whatever suits their purposes. You were just another tool to them, another way to get what they wanted. The weight of his words pressed down on me, but I needed to confront them with what I'd learned. I needed to look them in the eye and see if they'd finally tell me the truth. So I went back home, armed with the knowledge Mr. Clark had given me, ready for a confrontation. I found them in the kitchen, casually sipping coffee as if everything were normal. I could barely contain my anger as I walked in, gripping the documents in my hand like a weapon. We need to talk, I said, my voice low but firm. They exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. My father set down his coffee cup, raising an eyebrow. What's this about, Liam? I tossed the documents onto the table. I know everything. I know about the money, about the scams, about how you've been stealing from people for years. And I know you used me to do it. My mother's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. I don't know what you think you found, but you're mistaken. We haven't done anything wrong. Don't lie to me. I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. I've seen the bank statements. I've talked to Mr. Clark. I know exactly what you've been doing. For a moment, they were silent, and then my father let out a bitter laugh. You're so naive, Liam. You think you know everything just because you found a few papers? You don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about. My mother nodded, her face twisted with contempt. You've always been so eager to believe the worst. It's pathetic, really. All this time, you've been benefiting from our lifestyle, and now you want to turn on us? After everything we've done for you? Benefiting? I spat, my hands shaking with rage. You've been stealing from people. You've been lying to me my entire life. Do you even care about me, or was I just part of the act? They didn't answer, but their silence spoke volumes. I felt a wave of nausea as the truth finally settled over me. They weren't just criminals. They were my parents. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had been using me, manipulating me, treating me like a pawn in their twisted game. But there was something else. Something Mr. Clark had hinted at. Something that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I looked back at my parents, searching their faces for any hint of the truth. Am I even your son? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. My father's expression faltered, a flash of something. Guilt? Regret? Crossing his face. But my mother stepped forward, her face hard and unyielding. Of course you are, she said, her tone sharp. Don't be ridiculous. But I didn't believe her. I could see it now, the way they avoided my gaze, the way they shifted uncomfortably, the way they were both refusing to meet my eyes. The truth was right there, just out of reach, and I knew they weren't going to give it to me. I turned on my heel and left, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. I needed to know more, to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of their lies. If they weren't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I went back to Mr. Clark, desperate for any more information he could provide. He seemed unsurprised to see me, as if he had expected this all along. I need to know if they're really my parents, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I need to know who I really am. Mr. Clark nodded, his face solemn. I've always suspected there was more to your story than they let on. I'll help you, Liam. Whatever it takes, we'll find the answers. Together, we began piecing together the fragments of my past, digging through old records, searching for any clue that could reveal the truth. It was slow work, but bit by bit, we started to unravel the web of lies my parents had woven. We found more documents, more evidence of their schemes. They had blackmailed wealthy people, using me as leverage, making them believe I was somehow in need or at risk. They'd preyed on people's sympathies, twisting the truth to suit their needs, using me as a tool to manipulate and deceive. The more I learned, the angrier I became. I felt like a puppet, like my entire life had been orchestrated by people who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. But there was one piece of the puzzle that still eluded me: my identity. If they weren't my real parents, then who was I? Where did I come from? With Mr. Clark's help, I began to delve into old birth records, adoption files, anything that might give me a clue. I felt like I was grasping at straws, chasing shadows, but I knew I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth, even if it meant tearing apart everything I had ever known. My parents had stolen my childhood, my trust, my very sense of self, but they weren't going to take my future. Whatever I found, whatever dark secrets lay buried in the past, I was ready to face them. I would uncover the truth, no matter what it cost me. For the first time, I felt a strange sense of freedom, a clarity that cut through the fog of betrayal and anger. I was no longer just Liam, the son of thieves. I was someone else, someone who was finally ready to uncover the truth and reclaim my life. And I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't stop until I had all the answers. My entire world had been turned upside down, but I still didn't have all the answers. After confronting my adoptive parents, I was left with more questions than ever. They had denied everything, but I knew they were lying. Every time I thought I understood the depth of their betrayal, something new would come to light, revealing an even darker truth. I felt like I was chasing shadows, trying to piece together fragments of a life that no longer felt like mine. Mr. Clark had continued to help me dig into my past. It was he who had suggested we look through legal records, old files that might contain the proof I needed. If there were any documents that could confirm my suspicions, they had to be somewhere, buried deep within the archives. He and I spent days poring over paperwork, searching for something, anything, that could shed light on my origins. Then, I found it. At the bottom of a box filled with dusty files, I discovered a set of documents that changed everything. They were adoption papers, old and yellowed with age, but still legible. As I held them in my hands, I felt a chill run down my spine. There, in black and white, were the names of my biological parents, people I had never heard of, people who weren't the ones who had raised me. My heart pounded as I scanned the pages, trying to make sense of the information. My biological parents had been wealthy, influential people, and according to the paperwork, I had been adopted shortly after birth. But something didn't add up. There were strange notations in the margins, references to a ransom payment, to a sum of money that had been exchanged for my safe return. I could barely breathe as I pieced it all together, the horrifying truth dawning on me in a slow, agonizing wave. I hadn't been adopted. I had been kidnapped. I felt numb, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me like a physical force. My entire life had been a lie, orchestrated by people who had stolen me from my real family, who had held me for ransom like a pawn in some twisted game. I was nothing more than a commodity to them, a means to an end. I knew I had to find my real family. If they were still out there, if they had been looking for me, then I needed to know. I needed answers, needed to understand why this had happened and what had become of them. And I needed to confront my adoptive parents one last time, armed with the truth they had tried so hard to keep from me. With Mr. Clark's help, I began the search. We combed through records, traced names, made calls. It was a long shot, but I had to try. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found a lead. My biological family had changed their names, moved to a different state, but they were still out there, still hoping that one day they would find me. I arranged to meet them at a small cafe, a neutral place where we could talk without distractions. My hands shook as I walked in, my heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and fear. I had no idea what to expect. Would they even recognize me? Would they want anything to do with me after all these years? I spotted them immediately, a man and a woman sitting at a corner table, their faces etched with lines that spoke of years of worry and heartache. They looked up as I approached, their eyes widening as they took me in. "Liam?" the woman asked, her voice trembling. I could see the hope, the fear, the disbelief in her eyes, and it took everything I had not to break down right then and there. "Yes," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "It's me." They both stood, and before I knew it, they were embracing me, holding me as if they were afraid to let go. It was overwhelming, a rush of emotions that threatened to drown me. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of belonging, a connection that went beyond words. When we finally sat down, they told me everything. How I had been taken from them, how they had searched for me, how they had done everything in their power to bring me back. They explained how my adoptive parents had demanded a ransom, a large sum of money that they had paid in the desperate hope that it would secure my future. They had believed, somehow, that I would be safe, that the people who had taken me would do the right thing. "We never stopped looking for you," my biological mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Not a day has gone by that we haven't thought of you. Hoped that you were okay, that somehow you would find your way back to us." I sat there, numb, as they recounted the years they had spent searching, the dead ends, the heartbreak, the endless waiting. I felt a strange sense of guilt, a weight that pressed down on me as I realized the pain they had endured. But more than that, I felt a burning anger, a fury that threatened to consume me. My adoptive parents had stolen me, had kept me from my real family, had manipulated and lied to me for my entire life. And for what? Money? Control? I couldn't understand it, couldn't comprehend the cruelty that had shaped my life, that had stolen so many years from me. Armed with this new knowledge, I returned home, determined to confront them one last time. They needed to know that I had found out the truth, that I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. They had lied to me, stolen from me, and used me, but I was done playing their game. I found them in the living room, sitting together as if nothing had happened, as if their world wasn't about to come crashing down. I stood in the doorway, watching them, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I prepared to shatter the illusion they had so carefully crafted. "I found them," I said, my voice cold and steady. They looked up, confusion flickering across their faces. "Who?" my adoptive mother asked, feigning ignorance. "My real parents," I replied, stepping into the room. "I found them, and they told me everything. I know about the ransom, about how you kidnapped me, how you've been lying to me my whole life." For a moment, they were silent, and then my father scoffed, a sneer twisting his lips. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," I said, stepping closer. "I've seen the documents. I've heard their side of the story. You took me from them, held me for ransom, and when they paid, you kept me anyway. You've lied to me about everything." My mother stood up, her face pale, her hands trembling. "We did what we had to do," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You were better off with us. They couldn't have given you what we did." "Better off?" I spat, my anger boiling over. "You think I'm better off with people who would steal a child, lie to him, manipulate him for his entire life? You think that's better?" They didn't answer, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. They knew I was done, that I wasn't going to be their pawn anymore. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, their world crumbling around them. I didn't look back. I had a new family now, a family that had never stopped searching, that had never given up hope. I was going to find my own path, rebuild my life on my own terms, free from the lies and deceit that had defined my existence. For the first time, I felt free, truly free, to be who I was meant to be. The truth had been painful, but it had also set me free. And as I walked away from the only home I had ever known, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope, knowing that I was finally going to be able to live my life on my own terms. The decision to press charges against my adoptive parents was not one I took lightly. I knew it would dredge up pain and force me to confront the darkest moments of my past. But I also knew it was necessary. I couldn't allow them to continue living their lives unpunished, free to manipulate and deceive as they always had. This was about justice, about making things right, not just for me, but for my biological family who had suffered for years without answers. The courtroom was intimidating. It was a large, imposing space, with high ceilings and a judge's bench that seemed to tower over everything else. I felt a chill as I entered, a sense of foreboding that made me wonder if I was really ready for what lay ahead. But I reminded myself that I wasn't alone. My biological family was there, their presence a constant reassurance, a reminder that I had people in my corner. The trial began with opening statements. The prosecutor, a steely woman named Miss Halpern, addressed the jury with a calm but powerful presence. She laid out the facts of the case, detailing the years of deceit, the forged adoption, and the ransom payment. Her words were precise, each one carefully chosen to highlight the gravity of what my adoptive parents had done. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, her voice echoing through the courtroom, "this case is not merely about fraud or abduction. It is about betrayal, manipulation, and the utter disregard for the life and well-being of a child. Mr. and Mrs. Evans," she gestured toward my adoptive parents, seated at the defendant's table, "saw an opportunity to exploit a family's love and desperation, and they seized it without remorse. They took a child from his parents, used him as a pawn, and have continued to lie and deceive without a hint of conscience." I looked over at them as she spoke. They sat there, cold and unflinching, their faces masks of indifference. It was as if they didn't feel anything, as if the lives they'd shattered meant nothing to them. They refused to look at me, their eyes fixed on the table in front of them. I felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment that threatened to consume me. But I took a deep breath, grounding myself. I needed to stay focused, to keep my emotions in check. Then it was my turn to testify. I walked to the witness stand, each step heavy with the weight of what I was about to say. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, the judge, the jury, my biological family. I took a seat, gripping the edges of the chair as I prepared to recount my story. I spoke of my childhood, of the lies my adoptive parents had told me, the way they had manipulated me, used me. I told the court about the wedding day when I'd overheard them, how it had shattered my world, and how I'd uncovered the truth piece by piece. I recounted my confrontation with them, their cold denials, their refusal to acknowledge the harm they'd done. And finally, I spoke of finding my real family, of learning that they had paid a ransom, believing it would secure my future. As I spoke, I could feel the tension in the room. The jury listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and sympathy. My biological parents sat in the audience, tears in their eyes, their hands clenched together as if they were holding on to each other for strength. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing how much they had suffered because of the people who had raised me. But I pushed that feeling aside. This wasn't the time for guilt. It was a time for truth. When I finished, the defense attorney stood up to cross-examine me. He was a slick, smarmy man named Mr. Layton, with a voice that oozed condescension. He approached the stand with a smile that was meant to be reassuring but only made me feel sick. "Mr. Liam," he began, drawing out my name as if it were a joke, "you've had a very difficult experience, haven't you? Learning that the people who raised you weren't who you thought they were must have been incredibly traumatic." I nodded, wary of his intentions. "Yes, it was. But," he continued, "isn't it possible that you're exaggerating your feelings? That, perhaps, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment? After all, Mr. and Mrs. Evans raised you, provided for you, took care of you. Don't you think it's a bit harsh to accuse them of such terrible things?" I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. They took me from my real family. They lied to me my entire life. Whatever they did for me was only to serve their own interests. He smiled, as if I had proven his point. "So you're saying they provided you with a stable home, with love and support. But now, because you've learned about your biological family, you're willing to throw all of that away?" I could feel my anger rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. They didn't provide me with love or support. They manipulated me, used me as a pawn. I was never anything more to them than a means to an end. The defense attorney tried to poke holes in my story, to twist my words, to make it seem as if I were being ungrateful, spiteful. But I held my ground, refusing to let him undermine the truth. I could see the jury watching, their expressions reflecting a growing sense of indignation at his line of questioning. I knew they could see through his tactics, that they understood the gravity of what my adoptive parents had done. After my testimony, other witnesses took the stand. Mr. Clark testified about his suspicions, about the conversations he'd had with my parents, about the way they had exploited and manipulated everyone around them. My biological parents spoke as well, recounting the horror of losing me, the anguish of paying a ransom, the endless search that had led them to this moment. Finally, my adoptive parents were called to the stand. I watched as they took their seats, their expressions still cold, their faces devoid of any remorse. They tried to defend themselves, to paint themselves as victims, to argue that they had done what was best for me. But their words rang hollow, their lies unraveling under the weight of the evidence. The prosecutor questioned them relentlessly, her tone sharp and unforgiving. She exposed their contradictions, their inconsistencies, their blatant disregard for the truth. She presented the documents, the bank statements, the ransom notes, each piece of evidence a nail in the coffin of their defense. "What do you have to say about the ransom payment?" she demanded, her voice dripping with disdain. "How do you justify taking money from these people, from the parents of the child you stole?" My adoptive mother hesitated, her face pale, her hands trembling. We needed the money," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The prosecutor leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "So you admit it then? You admit that you took a child from his family, demanded money, and then kept him under the guise of love and care?" My mother looked away, unable to meet her gaze. My adoptive father, however, remained defiant, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. "We did what we had to do," he said, his voice filled with venom. "We gave him a better life than he would have had with them." The prosecutor let out a bitter laugh. "A better life? You call this a better life? A life built on lies, on manipulation, on theft? You took a child from his family, used him as a pawn, and you think you were doing him a favor?" The courtroom was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. I felt a surge of vindication, a sense of justice finally being served. My adoptive parents' lies had been laid bare, their cruelty exposed for all to see. There was no escaping the truth now. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was only a few hours. When they returned, their faces were solemn, their verdict a final condemnation of the people who had stolen my life. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts," the foreman announced, his voice steady and unwavering. "Kidnapping, fraud, emotional abuse. We recommend the maximum sentence, with restitution to be paid to the victims." The judge nodded, his face grim as he delivered the sentence. "Mr. and Mrs. Evans, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 10 years. Furthermore, all assets, savings, and remaining financial holdings will be seized and distributed to Mr. Liam and his biological family as compensation for the pain and suffering you have caused." I felt a wave of relief, a sense of closure that washed over me like a balm. The people who had stolen my life, who had manipulated and betrayed me, were finally being held accountable. They would pay for what they had done, and I would finally be free to reclaim my life, to rebuild on my own terms. As I left the courtroom, my biological family by my side, I felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that the scars of my past would take time to heal. But I also knew that I had a future that was mine to shape, mine to control. We returned home, where they welcomed me with open arms, offering me the love and support I had always craved. It wasn't an easy transition, but it was a start. I knew that I had people who cared for me, who had always cared for me, and that was enough. As I stood in their home, surrounded by the warmth of their presence, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never known. My past was painful, but it was behind me. My future was uncertain, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt truly free, ready to reclaim the life that had been stolen from me.